Welcome to Broadband Action. This is a podcast presented by Community Broadband Action Network. I'm Curtis Dean, one of the co-founders of CBAN and one of your hosts of Broadband Action, bringing in our other host of Broadband Action, John Willow.
Hello.
And hey, John, we're really excited for today's covering the broadband beat is the topic. And we've got Karl Bode. He is a writer. He's been writing about broadband for a long time. I was telling Karl before we got started, when I first got involved in broadband in 1999, 2000, I stumbled upon one of your very early efforts in the broadband space, a website called DSL Reports. And I learned a lot through that. And it was a great way to spy on what the competitor was, what their customers were saying about him. So, Karl, welcome.
Visual on the DSL report.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, that was a while ago, Karl. Not to dwell on DSL reports, but that was when people still had DSL.
Yeah, that was early on. IDSN,
yeah, that's right.
It's been so long, I've forgotten the name of it. But the old sluggish
line at my radio station many years ago. It's crazy.
Sluggish DSL lines, and people gamers would get excited about having low pings versus high pings. And you're a much more impressive gamer if you had a low latency.
It was cool that you had a website that back in the days when people still did occasionally talk about that stuff on BBS. So
yeah, it was really a great forum for people to get together and talk about their access issues, which were all novel. You couldn't go on Reddit or you couldn't go on Twitter and complain about Comcast because this was a new technology. People really didn't understand how it worked or the details or why is my latency high or why are my routes strange to Cleveland? Why is my connection sluggish? So it was a great foundational place, and it gave me a really good opportunity to study the industry for good and bad as to how it operated and how companies deployed.
What brought you to the topic in the first place?
I was in New York City as an IT. Did IT work in New York City for law firms around the city. And I basically went on there. I'd gotten a speakeasy DSL line that I was having trouble with. So I joined DSL Reports just as a member, started griping about it. And the owner of the website, Justin Beach, liked my silver tongue, I guess. And so he brought me on to occasionally write about the industry. So for about 15 years, day in, day out, I pretty much studied everything broadband companies did. And I eventually, as I did that, I noticed some trends that kind of shifted my personal slant a little bit more towards consumer protection, because I saw a lot of the coverage was very industry focused. There's a lot of trade magazines that were well funded talking about broad strokes and not a lot of stuff that was looking at the angles from the consumer perspective. So I tried to really make that my beat because I felt it was underrepresented.
Well, I'm sorry, Curtis. You go.
No,
ahead.
Go ahead, John.
No, I was just wondering. So you started with a personal beef, and before you knew it, 15 years have gone by, and now you're like an industry expert.
Yeah, it's been an interesting trajectory as journalism has struggled. DSL struggled with ad revenue, and so eventually they couldn't afford to have very many staffers anymore. So I jumped into the freelance beat, and I do a lot of writing now for The Verge and TechTurd and a bunch of different websites. And I also do writing now for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which has been a good shift because I'm very interested in their focus on local solutions to complicated problems.
I was so excited when I saw your name started as a byline on the ILSR stuff, and boy, they've really stepped up their game as far as that regular content presentation on their website. So I would say anybody who's listening to or watching this podcast, if you haven't been to muninets.org, you are missing out on a great part of the conversation that's going on in the broadband industry. So check that out.
Yep.
I always had a really good relationship with them as a journalist. They were really good focus on local broadband, and it's been a nice transition for me because a lot of my time previously was spent writing about federal dysfunction on policy, which can be a convoluted and frustrating beat given the corruption and other things that influence our policy trajectory. So it was really nice. It's been excellent and good for my mental health to shift more on focusing on what people are actually doing in small towns and cities, and then what they're building. Talking to people that are just taking direct action, block by block, to counter ensure people get affordable access. It's been great.
That's been a thing for CBAN too. We started in a more generalized way with broadband support, and then found that where the work was needed for us, where the attention wasn't going with people with a deep bench of expertise, was to the local level, to communities trying to afford, to afford, not in just in the money way, sorry, broad use of the word, afford themselves options for locally controlled broadband. That's where the action is. It's just all politics is local, all life change is local.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So it's really gratifying.
Yeah, federal policy has not impressed me for a very long time in terms of broadband, for multiple reasons I won't get into. Yeah, it's just all the solutions are late or performative, or they don't really fix the actual problems. And I think community broadband, with the infusion of the COVID relief money and the infrastructure bill, that just lit a flame under it. And then everybody's experiences during COVID, how frustrated people were with realizing, broadband really is important. It is an important utility. There was a debate there for a good decade or two. Well, is broadband an essential utility, or is it a luxury? Industry declared it a luxury, so it didn't have to deal with some of the regulations related to utilities. But all these people during COVID had such miserable experiences getting their kids online for class, or remote VPNing into their corporate job, that it really illustrated to people that things needed to improve. And so this big infusion of money, although I know the implementation will have some hiccups along the way, I think this big infusion of money is really going to be transformative. So
that's what the hope is, right?
Yeah.
That's all we can do is hope. But I think that's an important point about local action. Because and we've visited with people in communities throughout the years, work that I've done, work CBAN has done, and sometimes you notice that people in a community may feel like, well, this is my problem, but somebody else needs to solve it. And one of the most important things you can do, whether it's broadband or any other local issue, is get people to take ownership of that issue and understand that I have to be part of the solution, because the government, big cable, those folks aren't going to bail you out. You're going to have to do something and take action at a local level, whether that means building your own network or recruiting another company to build a network or whatever. So,
yeah. And you saw, with cities like Chattanooga and Longmont, they really were inspirational. Once those cities built those networks and showed that it was possible, it's not only possible, it's preferable to locals. Those providers are more locally accountable to local people. They get complained at in the grocery store if their connections don't work. The money isn't being sent to a company halfway around the world.
That's a big sell that goes across partisan lines. Have you noticed that in your coverage?
Yeah. Yeah. This is the disdain for Comcast is one of companies like Comcast, these big monopolies, is bipartisan in nature. It really is. It truly burns right through, and you see the motivation and support for a lot of these networks is bipartisan. Even though I think there's an active interest to make it polarized politically, on a broader federal level sometimes. And some companies, I think, have an active interest in making it a partisan issue. But it really is, when you talk to people locally, everybody just wants an affordable, decent connection, and they've seen how we've been doing it for a long time in terms of these high geographical monopolies. And they've seen that hasn't delivered them what they want. And community access is doing that.
And yet, despite the fact that community broadband networks are as popular or more popular than ever, and despite the fact that issues like broadband are really bipartisan or maybe even nonpartisan in this day and age, we still have big telecom doing everything they can whenever they can to try to block communities from making their own decisions. Have you noticed that trend picking up again lately, Karl? Because it seems from my view that it's picked up again here in the past.
It has, yeah. During COVID, I don't think it was very fashionable for a big telecom to come out and kind of launch some of these campaigns against community broadband, because people were seeing the real practical use of these services. So I think I saw it kind of decrease. You even saw the number of the state bills that telecom giants have lobbied for decrease. I think you saw them drop by 3 or 4 different states, drop them, realizing they were counterproductive. But yeah, I noticed now that COVID concerns have waned, the trajectory is kind of reversed, and you're seeing a lot more attacks by big companies. Some of them create fake consumer groups. One company created one in Maine that was basically a fake consumer group whose entire purpose was to spread misinformation about what these networks do. You see that they have a lot of tendrils in consultancies and think tanks and lobbying firms that spend a lot of time trying to seed the idea that these are just automatic taxpayer boondoggles. But it's a very hard sell when you get into the local populace.
It very much is. We have some CBAN members and that have built networks here just the past few years, where representatives of these dark money groups would go to their meetings and stand on the chair and say, "Oh, this is a horrible idea. You're putting people's money at risk." And then you go out to the parking lot, you get into a car with an out-of-state license plate and drive away.
Yeah.
People see through that, even though.
Yeah.
But you can't just let it operate in a vacuum. You have to constantly push back against that and tell the truth and tell the real truth about these issues, as opposed to just letting them fill the air with garbage.
Yeah, they're very good at repetition. They're very good at using repetition. This is a boondoggle. This is going to be a risk to taxpayers. These big companies don't want anything that disrupts those regional monopolies at all.
They all learned it in their ALEC training in the 20s.
Yeah,
oh, absolutely.
Why did they latch onto the word boondoggle? That seems to be. It's such a 18th century word that I just don't understand why they keep using it.
I'm not sure. The irony to me is that a lot of these companies have gathered billions upon billions upon billions of dollars in subsidies for networks that are always kind of mysteriously only half deployed. For 20 years, big companies like AT&T were just funneled tons of money. Charter, Comcast, tons of money. And the networks are always never quite completed. There's always some concern, we couldn't quite get it done. So for them to complain about taxpayer boondoggles in the first place is kind of ironic and silly.
We do spend some time chasing those dark money op-eds around the country and writing our own CBAN letters back. I mean,
it's important to challenge that stuff.
It is important to keep track of it. But do you think there's a possibility, Karl, with everything in play like this? Like you were saying, when you started doing this coverage, you latched onto the idea that local was, local control was self-sufficiency, it was safety, it was prosperity. We felt the same way at CBAN when we started doing our work, but it was 2017 and 2018 when we formally organized CBAN, and we didn't really think anybody was going to come and help. We just started doing the work.
True.
So this evolution has been really interesting, and now when we're just sitting around at the end of the day drinking, just kidding. When we're sitting around at the end of the day shooting the breeze, we ask ourselves, I wonder, at this point, could broadband become like a third rail issue where people won't mess with it too much? Along like Social Security, right? Could it become such an important thing that it's not, it could be, you can screw with it, like you can screw with Social Security, but no one would let you take it away.
It looked that way during COVID. If you asked me that question during peak COVID, I would have said yes. But now that we're past that point and some of the interest is waning, in the subject, when I look around at journalism, the interest in covering telecom has waned substantially. There was a peak there during the net neutrality fights, but in the years since, ad engagement based press outlets really want to focus on stuff that gets clicks. So their focus right now is cryptocurrency or new gadgets or AI hype, or stuff that's kind of scary, like AI taking over the world, and getting people affordable access to broadband just doesn't make them money.
It's not very
journalism. So so they just don't cover it. So I'm lucky. The number of clients that I can even work for has steadily shrunk because their interest in these subjects is slow, even though it's foundational to how the internet works. Getting people online at affordable rates is foundational for all this other gee-whizzery that they're so obsessed with, but they're really not as interested in covering it, I've found lately. So it's a complicated issue.
So all three of us have backgrounds in journalism and news. And one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot, I've been so frustrated by how the ACP was just allowed to die with very little media attention. And, I pay attention to the media attention of the things I care about because that's my lens. But I was just shocked. I was shocked at how little public support built for that. Again, that's an issue. What happened?
Again, the entire journalism industry is ad engagement based. It's run by people who are simply interested in exclusive growth at impossible scale. You see it with the collapse of all of these news organizations all around the country that are chasing this scale. And the only way to do that is to get people to click on hyperbole and controversy, and getting low-income families connected to broadband doesn't generate that kind of money. So it just wasn't talked about. So that program kind of came and went. The outrage was minimal. It got, very little traction in the press. And it was frustrating for me to see that as well.
Yeah.
And it's probably not something that will necessarily translate politically to votes. at least I don't think we're going to see 23 million people losing their ACP, deciding to go vote for one candidate or the other based on that. Our politics in this country are so fractionalized that they're going to vote on some other issue, whether it's jobs or security or whatever. So
I mean, it's not even driven by facts half the time anymore.
It isn't.
It's gut feelings.
Right.
You know, most of the voting habits are gut feeling based at this point.
Yeah,
driven
not
by,
on this show. We just
I like facts. I appreciate facts.
Facts and strong opinions are
good.
But separated clearly.
Yeah, exactly. So,
well, a couple things I want to throw out to you. And John, this is a surprise. You didn't know about this, but I just had another call and it made me think about this. What are some of the regulatory things that are going on right now? And I know you're not an expert on regulatory issues, but there's some of them that just are fascinating to me, you know, like, for example, net neutrality. Sounds like the FCC is about ready to finally pull the trigger on that. Issues like, you know, reform of the USF. So the funding program for the connected or for the United. What am I trying to say?
That thing. Lifeline.
Yes, thank you. And so, what are some of the big challenges you see that the industry is facing on a regulatory basis that maybe something you have a strong opinion on?
So the big one right now is you're probably familiar with how the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund didn't go precisely as the FCC had planned it. There was a lot of defaults. There was a lot of companies that made big promises they didn't deliver on or speculated just to elbow out, underbid, on certain grants so that they could elbow out smaller competitors, stuff like that. But technically, under laws related to the infrastructure bill and the BEAD funding, the $42.5 billion in BEAD funding, if you're defaulted in those areas, you technically can't qualify for BEAD money.
Right.
So at no fault of their own, a lot of these smaller local communities may be left out of one of the most historic and possibly generational subsidy opportunities in history because of a big mess with the RDOF. So that's been the big fight to get the FCC and NTIA and states and everybody to work together and make sure that these municipalities and areas aren't screwed over and can access that BEAD money. That's been a big one.
What do you think about the idea that's been floated about giving amnesty to those RDOF ne'er-do-wells so that they can back out without penalty, so those areas can be released for other funding?
I think it makes sense, provided there's still penalties for these companies. I don't think you should have like blanket amnesty. I think some groups were upset that they thought this would be blanket amnesty, but my understanding is that big coalition wasn't pushing for blanket amnesty. They were pushing for, just their goal is to kind of get people to default now so that we can get the ball rolling and get them out. But to get this to work requires a lot of agency interplay that's going to be very uncharacteristic for agencies that move slowly and don't work well together.
And not a ton of time to get it done either.
BEAD money is flowing. I mean, Louisiana, I think, is going to start building this year at some point. Most money will come next year, but I think some states will start moving this year. So it's very late in the game for these areas that were eager for RDOF funding to suddenly pivot and create, new programs that can get them the infrastructure bill money.
There have been some state programs that have been similarly confusing or awkwardly executed too. That are kind of putting some smaller communities in particular in a double bind. Yeah.
And as for the net neutrality thing, I was reading about that this morning. There's some experts who don't think that the new rules they're pushing are actually quite as tough as the ones that were eliminated. So there's still some wiggle room on stuff like throttling and interconnection debates and stuff like that. So that's something to keep an eye on. I think a lot of these regulators would very much like to get the whole net neutrality debate just put in the rearview mirror and move on to other conversations. Because that was 20 years of debate. A lot of it that wasn't, was a little factually dubious sometimes and hyperbole prone. And I think the real focus for now, net neutrality is good. I think, restoring the rules is good. I think giving the FCC the authority to oversee the industry is good. But I think the focus needs to be on regional monopolization. A lot of these policy band-aids that are coming in. Net neutrality is basically a band-aid to account for symptoms that are caused by a lack of broadband competition. ISPs behaving badly because they have no accountability. They're huge. They have a monopoly. They can implement weird profiteering schemes without regulators or competition thwarting them. There's no organic market competition, and there's no regulatory oversight. And in that environment, bad things happen. So I think the net neutrality rules were, a kind of imperfect way to come in and try to address some of that. Now, I don't think they were always perfectly fair to smaller providers who suddenly had to face a bunch of regulatory burdens for behavior that big ISPs engaged in, but I do think they were generally well-intentioned. But at this point, I think the real focus needs to remain on the lack of competition and monopolization and the corruption that protects that monopolization, in states all across the country.
I've often used the parallel comparison that it's how we've operated broadband as a policy in this country is so different than how we've done with other what I would call public utilities. For example, power. Yeah. There was conscious decisions made 100 years ago that everybody needed electricity, and there was a pretty well thought out process whereby that was going to happen, and it included tightly regulated companies that basically had a local monopoly. Well, we got the monopoly part, but we never got the regulated part when it came to telecom. So yeah, it's not working.
And it's been interesting to see cooperatives pop up. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just say we might even still be a little bit ahead of that historically, because the original electricity industry was very Wild West. It was very privatized. It was very fractured, and it wasn't regulated at all. To the detriment of public safety, to the detriment of pirateering. So I think if we were really to look at it in depth, we would see that we're actually not on a dissimilar trajectory to how
it just may be too early to see that.
That we have now consciously condoned and sanctified vulture capitalism. And so there's more, but no, that's real. There's more working against the utilifying, if that's a word, not a word, but you know what I mean.
Utilification?
There you go.
Thank you, Karl.
Maybe. I'm not sure that's right. Yeah. It's been fun talking to cooperatives who have gone through this exact same cycle, exactly 100 years apart in terms of, rural electrification and trying to combat monopolization of power. 100 years later, doing the exact same thing, coming in and saying, oh, we're also going to add broadband to this mix. And all the resistances, all the lobbying, all the fighting by industry, it's very, history does repeat itself.
It does.
Funny. And we're not always keen on learning from history or experience. I know this in this country. So,
and when history doesn't repeat, it tends to rhyme. I can't remember who said that, but
exactly. So,
Well, this is a great. I think this is a great time for us to all get into our crystal balls. Then, so something we talk about a lot, me and Curtis in particular, but everybody over here at CBAN, is what's the future going to look like, right? We have people all of us, we're all in consensus. We've just had the conversation that locally controlled broadband is vitally important.
Yeah.
But do you think that ultimately, in your opinion, Karl, do you think ultimately locally controlled broadband is going to play a big role in ubiquitous connectivity? How's that going to work?
Absolutely. Essential. So my biggest concern right now is if you've tracked Supreme Court decisions, there's several of them coming that are going to basically attempt to gut the federal regulatory state, which means eliminate the regulators' independent ability to make decisions. So any kind of federal oversight of a lot of this stuff is going to be on the ropes. I mean, it's been lobbied against. The real goal of the bigger telecom monopolies is complete domination of the market with absolutely no government oversight whatsoever. I think they couch their arguments a lot to suggest that's not their goal, and I think they're about to get it with the Chevron doctrine ruling in particular. I think we're about to see a lot of the federal agencies be put on their heels. So that's going to impact everything from broadband deployment to environmental reform to labor rights. So this is coming, and that's another issue the press has not covered because it doesn't get a lot of clicks, even though the impact is going to be almost unfathomable if you consider that a lot of our federal regulatory agencies aren't going to have the independent authority to implement reform without the explicit approval of Congress, which is an industry push because they know they have Congress. They know they have Congress under their thumb. So if Congress doesn't explicitly approve it, it's not happening, and they can lobby Congress into dysfunction, and that's what they know is going to happen. So my concern is that the federal regulatory state is going to be dismantled successfully here over the next 10 years. And I think a lot of these organizations like the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and you folks are perfectly positioned to help municipalities as they slowly come to realize that, federal help isn't coming. Everything is going to be local. Everything is going to be built locally outward. And I don't say this to sound scary or to spread fear or to, dishearten anyone, but I think local solutions are going to be, for the next 10 to 20 years, they're going to be the primary and most important thing everybody can do, whether we're talking about journalism or broadband access or healthcare, building local, forging local, true connections locally. I think that's the direction the country is generally headed. Now, the FCC is shielded a little bit from that. They have a long enough legal history that a lot of their rulings have precedent that's been defended pretty well in the courts. So I think the FCC will be a little better off than sub-agencies. But as you've already seen, that agency is kind of always a little behind the ball already. And most of their federal solutions are kind of overdue and a little performative sometimes, in my opinion. So we'll see. That's my big concern. That's where my mind goes to a lot right now.
I've been really bothered myself, Karl, by the slow clawback of regulatory power to Congress, because just like simple fact, Congress people are not subject matter experts.
Exactly.
They're experts in their own community, ostensibly. That's what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make any sense on any level for people who are not subject matter experts to lead policy decisions in subject matter areas.
Yeah, exactly right. And that Chevron ruling effectively says that regulators can't make those policy determinations within the scope of the law. They can't use their specific expertise on a subject to make rules based on their knowledge of how things work. Only Congress can do that. And I don't, as you guys probably don't, I don't want most of these Congress folk determining very complicated broadband policy solutions.
No matter how right they were. If they were all Rhodes Scholars, they're not broadband experts, and it's a super specific thing.
Yeah. And again, the reason that industry wants this is because Congress is corrupt. I think that lead gets buried in stories all around the country. I've spent a lot of time reading about broadband, and I don't know, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but the amount of stories that even mention that monopolies exist or are a problem are negligible. It doesn't matter. You could click on any story about broadband, some development in broadband, and you would be hard pressed to find a single mention in the entire story that competition is a problem, lack of competition caused by both corruption, regulatory capture, and regional monopolization of broadband service. It just isn't mentioned for some reason. It's deemed as opinion, by a lot of news outlets that are kind of intimidated and a little feckless in terms of their coverage. And that's really frustrated me over the years. And I think this regulatory attack is going to be treated kind of similarly until we start to see the actual real world impact of these rulings out in the field, which could take a little while.
Well, Karl, I suppose we could go all the way down the rabbit hole or not, but when we talk about dismantling the structure, the state structure of the governing state, it's happening. It's not just happening with Chevron. It's happening in lots of other ways too, that are making it more risky, more vulnerable for communities to try to step forward and take action. There's less certainty for them. There's not a stabilized regulatory climate, and the politicization of all of it. I guess as a person also working in the field, that's one of my biggest concerns, because like you said, we started doing this work in the dark. We weren't expecting BEAD or anything like that. But we know that it's very hard to do all of that work and also run your community with 4 people in the office, or even 20 people in the office, still very small. And then when you're in a slippery policy situation where things are not easy to understand, or even more hard to understand than usual, I think for me, as a person working in broadband, that's my biggest fear about this deregulation, is that it's going to just throw marbles on the floor as people try to cross the room towards broadband.
It is. You're exactly right. Yep.
Well, it's that kind of massive shift that you think could be the kind of thing that might cause at some point a mind shift in the American public once they see what that means.
Yeah, exactly.
And they now see that OSHA can't make rules about workplace safety and somebody gets hurt. And I think
the public has to feel it. They have to feel the impact of these in a very tangible, real way, and I think they will. If the Supreme, there's some argument that the Supreme Court rulings won't be quite as radical as people are fearing, and I hope that's true. But I think if they do come, people are going to feel those impacts very real, and broadband and every other policy arena that people deal with. So we'll see. you know, I'm inspired by the work local people are doing, and I'm glad they're ahead of the curve. And one good thing we got from COVID is it really drew people together to build local solutions to problems across a wide variety of issues. So
we're inspired by them every day. So that's why we like swimming in our little swimming pool here. We get to deal with that.
That's a good space to inhabit.
Yeah, we're on the ground all the time, and we feel really lucky to be able to do this work this way.
Yeah.
Well, Karl,
so thank you, Karl.
Yeah,
thank you. I appreciate it.
Let's do this again sometime.
Powers our work.
Yeah, happy to be on any time. Sure,
absolutely. We don't often ask other people back to be guests, but you're right up there in the Doug Dawson category now.
I appreciate it. He's great.
He's great. He's like our hippie guru of the broadband industry. And
all
I
of
don't think he'd mind me telling
he's
him
all of our spiritual father, Doug Dawson.
Yes,
I like him a lot. Yeah.
Well, yeah, great time talking with you today, Karl. We wish you luck, and we'll keep reading your stuff, and hopefully we can all be working together to pull on the same end of the rope and helping local broadband communities be successful.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate you having me on.
See you again soon, Karl. I can tell this is the first of a long conversation we'll have.
Great. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
You bet. Yeah. Our guest today on Broadband Action has been Karl Bode, writer on the Broadband Beat. We want to thank you, everyone, for joining us here on Broadband Action. Until next time, we'll see you then.